Number 3. The Kuykendall family harasser. In 2007, the Kuykendall family of Fircrest, Washington, were subject to a 4-month-long campaign of harassment. The incidents began in February when the cell phone belonging to the family's 16-year-old daughter, Courtney, began sending text messages on its own to several of her friends. The content of these messages was mostly gibberish, and while this puzzled the family, it was only a harbinger of much worse things to come. Soon after the incidents with the text messages, the family began receiving threatening phone calls, both to their landline phone and to their cell phones. The caller, who would most often call during the night, would speak in a scratchy voice and would threaten them, often leaving voicemails if no one answered the phone. The threats ranged from those described as juvenile to threats to slit their throats and kill their grandparents. The police and the family's phone company investigated, and they reported that the majority of the calls were coming from Courtney's cell phone. Courtney denied making the calls, which often were made at times when her phone was turned off. With the technology of the time, it is relatively easy to make a phone call from one number appear as if it is coming from another number, a practice known as spoofing. But as the harassment escalated, the police and the phone company alike were baffled as to how some of the harasser's feats could have been accomplished. Courtney's phone and other cell phones belonging to family members began turning themselves on and changing their ringtones. After the family received several voicemails consisting of their own recorded conversations, they concluded that whoever was harassing them could also remotely activate their phone's audio recorders. 2 other families, who lived on the same block as the Kuykendalls, also began receiving threatening phone calls, which were traced back to Courtney's phone, or to other phones owned by other family members, or to phones owned by the other 2 families being targeted. The Kuykendalls all got new phones and changed their phone numbers, and at one point Courtney's phone was taken away, but still the calls continued. A spokesperson for the phone company Sprint stated, "We are unaware of any technology that would allow the activity that's being reported here." In addition to harassing them with calls, the unknown stalker was apparently also physically watching the family. He would call and describe what they were wearing, and he knew who was home when he called and who was out. Several times he would bang on the side of the house at night and run away. One of the family's neighbors, who was also targeted for harassment, reported how on one day, as she was cutting limes in her kitchen, the caller phoned to tell her that he preferred lemons. Then, as mysteriously as the harassment started, it stopped, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Some suspect the case to be nothing more than an elaborate hoax by the family, although for this to be the case, the other 2 targeted families would have had to have been in on it as well, and it is difficult to imagine 3 families conspiring together to perform an elaborate hoax for no logical reason. Since most of the activity seemed to center around Courtney, some suspect that this was nothing more than a case of bullying taken extremely far, but for this to be true, one also has to believe that a teenage bully was also such an expert hacker that he could manipulate cell phones in a way that would baffle both police and the phone company. 11 years later, we are no closer to any definitive answers, as the person or persons responsible for the Kuykendall family harassment remains unknown. Number 2. Beshear, Koushik, and LEnfant. Beshear Koushik was born in Syria in 1944. Eventually, he moved to Lebanon and married an American woman named Gail and was granted U.S. citizenship. In the early 1970s, he and Gail were living in Lebanon, where Gail worked as a singer. She often performed at the Phoenicia Hotel, a well-known gathering place for Middle Eastern diplomats and arms dealers. On July 1st, 1974, Beshear was on his way to pick up Gail from a party hosted by a Saudi princess when his car was ran off the road by men driving a van. They abducted him and held him hostage for several days, accusing him of being a CIA agent. He was tortured and given little food or water, and on the 5th day of his captivity, he attempted suicide by slashing his wrists. Surprisingly, his captors took him to a hospital to receive treatment, and he was released from captivity. He never knew who his captors were working for, although it was suspected that they may have been affiliated with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, abbreviated as the PLO. 2 months later, he moved back to the United States. He and Gail divorced, and Beshear became the manager of a North African restaurant in Hollywood. In the early 1980s, he and his family decided to open 2 Moroccan restaurants, both named Marrakesh, one in Philadelphia, managed by his sister, and one in Washington, D.C., managed by Beshear. In 1982, while his D.C. restaurant was still under construction, he began receiving strange phone calls shortly after the restaurant's phone line was installed. At first, the caller wouldn't say anything and would just breathe heavily when Beshear answered the phone. After the restaurant opened for business in 1983, the harassment escalated. The caller began threatening to kill Beshear and had details about his personal life. For example, the caller mentioned the names of friends and acquaintances of Beshear's, some of whom he had not seen in years. Curiously, the majority of these calls appeared to come from a child or someone imitating a child, and Beshear and his staff began referring to the caller as L'Enfant, French for the child. L'Enfant would call the restaurant as many as 20 to 30 times a day, often giggling and laughing, and would threaten Beshear or whoever else answered the phone, which led to a high turnover rate among his staff. Occasionally, screaming and the sounds of machine gun fire would be heard in the background of the calls. Sometimes, rather than threats, the caller would make sexually obscene statements instead. Although L'Enfant was the most frequent caller, several other people, or someone imitating other voices, would call as well, including a young girl, a black child, and adult men and women with Middle Eastern accents. Beshear speculated that the calls were somehow related to the time he had spent in captivity in Lebanon, but could not understand why he was being targeted nearly a decade after that experience. In the mid-1980s, the harassment turned violent. Beshear's car was found to have several stars of David scratched into the paint. Shortly after that, his car caught fire. His mechanic suspected that someone had tampered with the car's ignition system. When Beshear spent several weeks in Philadelphia at his sister's restaurant, the calls followed him there. Beshear asked the FBI to investigate the harassment, and a tap was placed on the restaurant's phone, which recorded more than 3,000 harassing calls in an 18-month period. The calls all originated from payphones within the D.C. metro area, and since some calls were placed within seconds of each other from phones that were miles apart, the FBI suspected that multiple perpetrators were involved. This is disputed by others who have studied the case, who speculate that the calls could have been the work of a single phone freak. Telephone hacking, known as phreaking, was the process of hacking analog telephone systems. Prior to the computerization of telephone systems in the 80s and 90s, phone systems used a series of tones to route calls. An early phone phreaker, Josephine Gracia, who was born blind, had perfect pitch, and at the age of 7, discovered that by whistling at certain frequencies, he could activate phone switches. Another early phreaker, John Draper, was given the nickname Captain Crunch because he discovered that a plastic whistle given out as a prize in Captain Crunch cereal produced a tone that would allow him to dial phone numbers simply by blowing it. By the early 1970s, many phone phreakers had built their own tone generators, called blue boxes, which they used to manipulate phone systems, and among them were Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, the future founders of Apple. While most phreakers were simply interested in free long-distance phone calls, or self-imposed challenges, such as seeing how many different switches they could route a call through, there was, of course, the potential for mischief, and it would not be above the abilities of a skilled phreaker to make a call appear as if it was coming from one payphone, and then make another call appear as if it was coming from a different payphone seconds later. The question is, why would this person bear such a grudge against a restaurant owner? In 1987, due to the stress resulting from the harassment, Beshear checked himself into a mental institution. While he was there, his replacement at the restaurant, Raj Tuli, became the target of LEnfant's harassment. While walking home from school, his son Richard was brutally beaten by two men. LEnfant claimed responsibility for the attack, and the words, "Richard will die," were found painted on the front door of the family's home. Police were never able to locate the two men who had attacked Richard. Some speculate that the attack on Richard was unrelated to the phone harassment, and that LEnfant simply claimed responsibility for it and wrote the threatening message. By 1993, Beshear had been living off and on in the mental institution for 6 years. The calls had decreased in frequency since their peak in the mid to late 80s, but LEnfant still made a few calls a week to the restaurant, and even managed to call Beshear at the mental institution. That year, the television program Unsolved Mysteries ran a segment on Beshear and LEnfant, and shortly after that, the harassment stopped as abruptly as it had began. There are several theories as to why the harassment stopped at this time. Some speculate that with the airing of the Unsolved Mysteries segment, the person, or persons, responsible for the harassment were worried about exposure and the possibility of being identified. Others, who support the phone freak hypothesis, believe that as this was around the time that most North American phone networks were becoming increasingly computerized, that the tools LEnfant used to hack analog phone systems would have become useless. There is also the question as to why Beshear was targeted. Was he simply a randomly chosen victim, or did the harassment have to do with the time he had spent as a prisoner in Lebanon? Journalist Louis Beale suspects that one of Beshear's abductors may have eventually become a diplomat or politician based out of D.C., and that the harassment was an attempt to drive Beshear out of the city so that he could not identify this individual. This would explain why he was not harassed while working in Hollywood. Years after the harassment, Beshear began to speculate that his captors had actually worked for Mossad, Israel's secret service. In 2002, he posted an ad in the Washington Post stating, "Have Zionists turned Jewish beliefs into a political party in the service of hatred and greed?" which drew the ire of the Anti-Defamation League. In his 70s at the time of this video, Beshear appears to be living a quiet life. The Marrakesh restaurant in D.C. continued to operate under different management until closing in 2017. The Philadelphia location, which is still owned by Beshear's family, remains in operation as of the time of this video and receives largely positive reviews. Number 1. Amy Billig and the Night Caller. On March 5, 1974, 17-year-old high school student Amy Billig came home from school for lunch. She phoned her father and asked to borrow money. He agreed, and after lunch, Amy set out to hitchhike across her hometown of Coconut Grove, Florida, to her father's office. She was last seen hitchhiking across Main Highway. She never arrived at her father's office and has not been seen since. Amy's disappearance was investigated by the local police, the FBI, and her parents, Susan and Ned, who went to considerable effort to locate their daughter. An early theory developed that Amy had been kidnapped by a biker gang that was traveling through Coconut Grove at the time of her disappearance. Susan and Ned managed to arrange a meeting with two members of the gang. The men said that they had never seen Amy, but told the couple that biker gangs sometimes kidnapped young women and sold them amongst themselves. In 1976, a biker named Dave contacted Susan after seeing a photo of Amy in a newspaper. He agreed to meet with Susan, and he told her that he had owned Amy at one time. According to Susan, he had described a scar on her body that had never been made public. Dave agreed to contact the person who he believed had Amy, and in June of 1976, he and Susan traveled to a tavern in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Amy would supposedly be delivered to them. A fight broke out, and Dave was injured. Another biker forcibly removed Susan from the tavern and placed her in a taxi. She never saw Dave again. Amy's father, Ned, died of lung cancer in 1993. Her mother continued to search for her, following leads which eventually even led her to Great Britain, where an investigator had claimed that a biker had offered to sell him an American woman who resembled Amy. This lead, like the others, never panned out. In a deathbed confession in 1997, former biker Paul Branch claimed that Amy had been taken to a biker's party on the day of her disappearance, and she had been drugged, raped, and killed, and her body fed to alligators in the Florida Everglades. This information has never been verified, and some authorities believe that Branch's wife had fabricated the supposed confession for publicity and money. While the FBI believes that it is possible that Amy was held captive by a biker gang at some point, they believe it's unlikely that Amy was alive for more than a few years after her initial disappearance. Of course, this is not the only possible explanation for her disappearance. As with most high-profile missing persons cases, there are other leads. Back in 1974, days after Amy had disappeared, her family received a phone call. The caller claimed to have kidnapped Amy, and he stated he was willing to return her for $30,000. Police were able to trace the call to 16-year-old twin brothers, Charles and Larry Glasser. They quickly determined that the brothers did not have Amy and did not even know her. They were subsequently charged with extortion. Sadly, the extortion call placed by the Glassers was not the last time that a phone call would torment Susan Billig. However, unlike the Glassers, who were quickly apprehended, the next caller would torment her for over 20 years. Beginning a few weeks after Amy's disappearance, Susan's phone began ringing late at night. She would answer, thinking the caller was Amy, only to hear silence on the other end. Police traced the call to a phone booth and staked it out, only for the calls to begin coming in from a different payphone. As the caller successfully avoided a number of stakeouts by rotating through several different payphones, police began to speculate that he was able to recognize the undercover police cars. After 5 months of silent calls, the caller spoke for the first time. "This is Hal Johnson," he said. "I have her." Over the following months and years, he continued to call Susan as many as 6 or 7 times a night. He told Susan that he had trained Amy for use as a sex slave. "She learns quickly. She's learning how to use her mouth in the right way," he would say. When Susan would ask for proof that the man had Amy, he would become elusive. In April of 1979, he told her to travel to Fort Pierce, Florida, to 913 Ohio Street, where he told her that Amy was going to be posing for an artist. Susan drove to Fort Pierce, only to discover that the last address on Ohio Street was 911. Over the years, Johnson traced Amy's supposed movements to Susan. She was taken by bikers from Coconut Grove to Fort Pierce, where he had trained her. She was then taken to Canada for a few years, and then to London. From there, he said, she was sold to Arabs in Saudi Arabia, where she perfected her sexual performance. In 1993, Johnson began making the calls from a cell phone rather than payphones. As cell phones were relatively new technology at the time, the calls were, for a time, untraceable. At around this same time, he began telling Susan that his clients were no longer satisfied with a woman of Amy's age, and that they desired a mother-daughter team. He told her that in order to save Amy, she would need to turn herself over for sexual training. He told her to place an ad in the Miami Herald newspaper that said, "Elderly woman seeks younger, masterful man." When she refused, he told her, "Watch out, Amy doesn't have long." In early October of 1995, Johnson told Susan that he had cut Amy's tongue out and that they were going to do more. On October 19th, she agreed to meet with Johnson in Dadeland, Florida, to discuss turning herself over to save Amy. She went with an FBI agent who was posing as her son. Arriving at the appointed meeting place, a deserted parking lot, Susan and the agent waited in the car for 15 minutes before Susan, overwhelmed with emotion, ran out of the car screaming for Johnson to show himself. He never did. 2 days later, detectives installed a new, state-of-the-art cell phone tracer in Susan's home. While they were still at the house, Johnson called. Now the police finally had his cell phone number. The cell phone was registered to an import company near downtown Miami. When the FBI went to the address, they discovered a U.S. government mail drop, which led them to suspect that the company was a phony corporation set up as cover for a federal operation. They now realized that for all these years, the mystery caller had been one of their own. Searching for the number in a government law enforcement directory, they matched it with a branch of U.S. Customs. Traveling to the office, they played tapes of Hal Johnson for a supervisor and another customs agent, who were both stunned to recognize the voice of one of their colleagues, Henry Johnson Blair, a highly decorated customs agent with over 24 years of service, who had once recovered a stolen Rubens masterpiece for the government of Spain. Blair was immediately taken into custody. At his trial for harassment, Blair claimed that he had never known Amy, and that his obsessive-compulsive disorder and alcoholism had caused him to harass Susan. He was given a 2-year prison sentence and ordered to pay $5 million to Susan. Despite Blair's insistence that he had never known Amy, his arrest caused police to look over some evidence from the time of her disappearance, and Blair is now considered a person of interest in her case. In her diary, Amy discussed the possibility of traveling to South America with a man named Hank, which was Blair's nickname. Blair's work with the Customs Department sent him to Argentina at around the time specified in the diary. Additionally, a photograph taken by Amy shortly before her disappearance shows a white van identical in color and model to the one that Blair owned in 1974. He was never charged in connection to Amy's disappearance, and he died in 2006 at the age of 59. Sadly, Susan Billig died in 2005 at the age of 80 without ever finding out what happened to her daughter. If Amy Billig is still alive, she would be 61 years old at the time of this video. Thanks so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give it a like, and check out my other videos, and subscribe.